Well, today news that annual wage growth has slipped to its lowest level in more than a year, falling well below Reserve Bank and Treasury expectations is a concern. With the government's mid-year economic update due in a few weeks' time, what does it all mean? Should we be worried? Joining me for their analysis on this and other economic news of the week is economics editor at the Australian newspaper Adam Crichton and business columnist for the Herald Sun and the Weekend Australian, Terry McCrann. Terry, these wage growth numbers out today, are they concerning to you?
To coin a phrase, Peter, I think we should be alert but not yet alarmed. We're talking about fairly marginal change, shifts, 0.5 versus 0.6. We're not talking about we've entered this 2% to 2.5% wages growth environment quite some time ago, so nothing has really fundamentally changed. And I personally take the view that this is just reflecting reality, the sort of reality that we now operate in the global economy, with all this relentless pressure downward on prices and wages, with China and the internet and globalisation and technology, so that the idea that we can suddenly go back to a world in which wages can go up by 3, 4, 5% a year just because we want it, to me that's a bit like saying that's the button which sits on the wall next to the button where we think we can alter the world's temperature by closing a coal mine. I mean, both of those things are completely unrealistic. I think the wages growth is at a reasonable level. I don't see it as a cause for concern, for alarm. Obviously, we'd like it to be a bit better, but I think the bottom line is that any suggestion that we should try and force-feed it higher would be far too damaging and destructive.
Yeah, let me play a grab from the chief economist at St George Bank. Pretty similar lines to you, Terry.
We are seeing structural factors at play. Globally, globalisation is increasing, technology is having an impact, and those structural forces we are seeing have an impact on weak wages growth in other major economies, and the story is not that different here.
So, Adam, is this pretty much, the new normal? This is I guess what Terry's trying to say is, yes, there's been movement into negative terms, but this is really what we should be expecting and not to overreact.
Yeah, look, I think that's basically true. I agree with all that Terry said. Look, it's still 2.2% wage growth is still higher than inflation. That's a good thing. It's certainly a much better outcome than for most of human history, when wages did not increase at all in real terms. So I think we still have to be positive. I mean, we're still advancing as a society. It's also worth pointing out too that our wages in Australia grew much faster than those in the UK and the US for a long time. So it's all very well to point out that wage growth in the US is about 3%. And in the UK, I think it's about 3% as well, 2.9%, I think, over the most recent year. So, of course, that's a little bit higher than here, but households here are still doing much better than equivalent households in the UK, say, 10 years ago, or the US.
Yeah, but just on that, do you have a pull-out figure at the top of your mind between what's public sector wage growth and what's private sector wage growth? Because our state Labor governments in particular really ratchet up the spending on wages paid by the taxpayer.
Yeah, look, it's extraordinary. In Victoria, public sector wages are rising at about 4%, I believe, or certainly high threes. It's been the case for some time now that every quarter the public sector wages grow by about 0.6, 0.7, and the private sector grows by about 0.4, 0.5. So, when you take that over years and years, that's actually a significant difference. And I think it's very worrying because it means that, where do our bright young people want to work? They want to work for the public sector, which in general is a lot less productive than the private sector.
Yeah, call me cynical, Terry, but that's a lot of union votes, isn't it, coming into elections for Labor governments?
Exactly, Peter. I just wanted to add 2 points to what Adam was saying. One, the private sector wages growth reacts to those global realities that I was talking about, which Adam endorses, whereas the public sector wages growth reacts to the reality of governments having their hands in our pockets. As long as they can take money, they can confiscate money from us, they'll pay those increased wages, and you get a positive feedback in terms of votes. The other point I think we should not lose sight of is that the low wages growth has been offset by the very strong employment growth. So I think, the idea that having more people in jobs rather than those in jobs getting higher wages is actually a much better positive outcome for Australia overall.
Yeah, I agree with you there. The banks have come out to say that they're having a horror year and some of the worst numbers since the recession, Adam. Pretty much self-inflicted, I have to say.
Yeah, look, largely. I mean, they say horror, but I mean, it's still pretty good. Their rates of return on equity are in the high single digits or the low double digits. That's certainly internationally very good. And look, it's no surprise that their margins are thinning, really. They have a lot more competitors. And I think finally people are waking up to the fact that the big four banks in particular are overcharging on mortgages in many cases. And there are many cheaper products out there to switch to. I'm actually refinancing myself at the moment. I think it's a no-brainer, really, not to do that. So before people criticise the banks for their profits, I think they really need to look at themselves and say, look, can I go and get a better deal?
Crocodile tears, do you reckon, Terry?
Well, absolutely. I don't know that the banks are saying that they, crocodile cry for us Argentina. They are saying realistically that they've had a very, very difficult year. And to reinforce Adam's point, it's actually surprising how well the banks have done given those difficulties, given the costs of haying, given the reality of the economy, given the property downturn, that temporary property downturn mid-year. And I think we've actually ended up in a space which I think is pretty attractive. As Adam said, it returns on capital which are reasonable but not excessive for the banks, which means that they are secure and safe. People can have confidence in them. But you're getting that competitive dynamic playing out, which is actually very good for both customers on both sides of the balance sheet, those borrowing money and those depositing money.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the RBA, because Tim Wilson, he's a Victorian MP, Liberal MP, chair of the House Economics Committee. Adam's written a letter in relation to the central bank, the Reserve Bank, urging them to consider the future approach. He doesn't like the idea that the rates kept coming down. He thinks that's disadvantaged particularly older Australians who've got money in savings. He's also worried about talk of quantitative easing. Now that's sort of surfaced in the last couple of days. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I think he makes some very good points. It was certainly quite surprising to read in recent days the new data that came out that showed as few as 1% of borrowers actually adjust their monthly mortgage payments when the rates of interest fall. So that would seem to undercut the RBA's argument that when it cuts rates, there's more money in the pockets of ordinary people to go and spend. And this was basically Tim's point, that the RBA has slashed rates by a very large amount, which has seen banks reduce their deposit rates, but the stimulus that it's supposed to have isn't really happening. And look, to be fair, so far he's right. If you look at retail sales, if you look at confidence, there hasn't really been a big change there. Now, the RBA would probably say, look, the effect takes 6 months to take effect. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that. Certainly we're seeing a change in the housing market, but that's just one part of the economy. So far, I think you'd have to say Tim's been right.
Just, Adam, remind me the number again. How many people, when rates go down, bring down their monthly repayments on their mortgage in line with the rate drop?
Well, for 3 of the major banks, it was only 1% of their borrowers.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. I don't think I've ever adjusted down what I put into my mortgage at all. Terry?
Yes.
Well, let's be very clear. The Reserve Bank does not want to go down the path of another cut because if you go have another cut, I mean, I agree with Adam that there would be more negatives out of that than positives. Damaging to confidence, you'd hurt more savers than you would benefit borrowers. And it certainly doesn't want to go into quantitative easing, both in terms of whether it would be effective. We've seen what the outcome in Europe is, and I think there's a big question mark over the effectiveness in Europe. But it also doesn't, the actual mechanical difficulties of going down the QE route in Australia are much more complicated than in the US or Europe. So it doesn't want to go there. And so I think the focus really should be on, let's take some time to let what's happened through the year play out. Come back at Christmas. I'm not saying you go to sleep, but come back at Christmas, both with the mid-year budget update and into the new year for the Reserve Bank to its next meeting in February. And that's the time when we can think about any further changes to policy.
All right, some detail out today about drought and the farming sector, how hard it's been hit by drought. But a couple of statistics jumped out at me. They say that the drought has savaged farm profits down by about a quarter. You would expect that. Prices for commodities, lamb, beef, dairy, all of them are up. Cereals up by 14% in particular. But this is the statistic that really struck me, Terry. The number of farms in Australia have halved since the mid-70s to about 90,000. That's all the farmers we've got left in Australia. And of 80% of the farming output that we measure in Australia, that 80% of farming output comes from 20% of our farmers.
It's extraordinary, and I think it's sort of been a silent disease that has crept up on us, and the farmers that have continued, and indeed the retailers getting their product to us at very competitive prices, getting good product to us at very competitive prices, has disguised this underlying destruction of what is fundamental, obviously not only to rural economies, but to ordinary Australians in terms of getting access to quality product at reasonable prices. So we are reaching the sharp end. I mean, Adam's followed it much more closely than me, but I think we really are getting very close to something which is fundamental in terms of how damaging it could be to Australia and to Australians.
Yeah, Adam, I listened to Richard Branson giving us free advice today to say Australia should stop exporting coal, should stop using coal, we should do it overnight. We're basically, you know, citizens of the world type thing. But if we don't have mineral exports and we don't have agricultural exports, the only thing left we've got is a university sector highly dependent on foreign students, which is a great vulnerability. And if you go back to the GFC, I mean, one thing that always sticks in my mind, when we were about to hit 2 quarters of negative growth that would take us into a technical recession, the only thing that saved our bacon, pardon the pun, was the farming sector, was agriculture. And, you know, no one can help the drought, absolutely. But if because of the drought and other tough farming conditions and land clearing and all the other stuff, red tape we load our farmers up with, if people leave the land, who's going to want to take it on as a career?
Yeah, certainly. Look, it's a big question. I mean, the farming sector is only 2.5% of jobs, but it's 15% of exports. So it certainly packs a real punch in our prosperity, and so it's very important to consider what's happening with the farming sector. The interesting thing I found just in that article that I wrote about farms is some farmers are actually doing quite well, no doubt. Of course, many of them very obviously are having a very tough time, but the farm management deposits have actually increased quite a lot, by 60%. Only a small fraction of farmers have these. This is a scheme where farmers can put their profits into an account and not pay tax on them until they withdraw the funds, and they've increased 60% to $5.7 billion over the past 5 years. So some farmers are doing well, but obviously the majority are not.
And where do you expect all of this sort of drought impact play out in terms of numbers next year?
Well, look, the frequency of droughts, I understand, has been increasing, so it's concerning for our growth figures. I mean, the RBA estimates that this drought will shave about 0.2 percentage points off our growth rate, and that's quite significant when the growth rate's about 1.5%, so that's a big chunk. You know, the kind of sad irony of this actually is the drought is kind of helping the RBA hit its inflation target in a kind of sick way, because, as you mentioned earlier, the price of lamb and beef and dairy is all up between 6 and 14% over the past 12 months, and of course that feeds into the CPI. So it's making inflation higher, which of course is one thing that the RBA wants. Of course it doesn't want it through drought, but nevertheless that's the effect.
Now, coming up before Christmas, Terry, we'll see the mid-year economic update, forecast, and MyEFO we call it. And I know in government it was one of these things that you were very conscious of the timing. It's usually late November, early December. You don't want to have it too close to Christmas because you don't want to be accused, particularly by the retail sector, of, you know, being a bit of a Scrooge, putting a dampening on any sort of spending. But already there's predictions that the retail sector isn't going to get the bump out of Christmas that it might have hoped. How fair is that?
Well, Coles today was saying that they're anticipating, it's not quite the same thing, I mean it's more necessity food, but they're actually looking forward to a good December. So again, you know, I think let's not jump to conclusions of doom and gloom. Let's just wait to see how the next month plays out.
Yeah, well, I'm not jumping on it, but I'm going by Deloitte's, who are saying that they expect it to be the worst since the 2013 festive season. Maybe they need a bit of Christmas cheer, you reckon, Terry? What do you think there, Adam? Yeah.
Can I just say, Peter, I think if the retailers had one wish for Christmas, it would be that in the mid-year budget update in December, the government brings forward some of these tax cuts, and then they might actually get some sort of retail hit, because they're certainly not going to. I mean, we just heard earlier that no one changes their mortgage repayments, and we know the tax cuts haven't really succeeded. So unless something happens, there certainly won't be a Christmas hit.
Yeah, you're right. Unless those tax cuts come, people won't have the free cash that everyone wants them to spend over the till come Christmas. Well, actually, it's over the internet these days. I've shown my age there when I talk about the till. Terry McCrann, Adam Crichton, thanks very much for your time.